So we really should try to start on time here because we have two groups to hear from, the clinicians as well as the people who identified themselves as patients or patient advocates.
As I am the first patient advocate to ever speak at one of these things, I may go over 10 minutes, and I hope you will indulge me, and that the audience will. I've tried to keep this fairly concise. Judy Dexter, age 70, Donald M., age 52, Arnie Stone, aged 87, Richard Croak, aged 48, Mary Regina Berman, aged 85, Edith, age 92, Josephine, age 79, Gail Mimna, age 64, Joe Tartabuano, age 51, and Peggy Lillis, age 56. All the people I have just named died from a C. diff infection over the past decade. Some, like my mother, died before FMT was in widespread use, but others have died since, either because it was not offered in time or it wasn't performed properly. They represent the tens of thousands of Americans who die every year from this largely treatable infection. For comparison, more people die now from C. diff than from HIV/AIDS, drunk driving, or MRSA. We started PLF when FMT for C. diff was in its infancy. By the time the source of my mother's infection was diagnosed, it would not likely have saved her. We've watched as its use has proliferated. We were excited that there was a treatment that finally was available for 20% of C. diff sufferers who do not respond to typical therapy. We were happy about the rise of biotech companies taking fecal transplant to the next level. And we have relations with many of these companies and with both provider-run and independent stool banks. I want to be absolutely clear. No one wants a fecal transplant. The sheer desperation it takes for someone to agree to have the poop of another person transplanted into their body is mind-boggling. But had FMT been an option for my mother in 2010, I would have asked the doctors for a bedpan, a bucket, and some privacy. We have always seen FMT as an intermediary step while we develop safe and effective microbial formulations that can be stably grown. But I'm frustrated that it's taken over 6 years and 3 draft guidances to get us this far. I'm also angry. I have been angry every day since my mother died 9.5 years ago. I'm also angry that after 6 years, that 6 years after FDA released its first draft guidance, you're still collecting data. Worse, it continues to be presented as just a question of science. But public policy is a moral and ethical pursuit. From military to housing to drug approval, we constantly weigh the potential benefits against the likely risks through an ethical and moral lens. FDA has updated its draft guidance twice. The 2014 update illustrates where science stops and policymaking begins. In it, providers were told to use donors known to themselves or the recipient. What is the scientific basis for that? There isn't one. Just as there is no scientific reason why I, a healthy adult male who's been with my husband for 18 years, cannot donate blood. I could if we abstained from sex for a year. Again, where is the scientific explanation? If married heterosexuals had to abstain for a year to give blood, you'd see a near cessation of blood donations. Since very few people would forgo sex for just a year so they can donate blood, it's a de facto ban. There's a similar dynamic between the gay blood ban and the lack of progress in regulating FMT. Though gay people have won broad acceptance and rights since HIV led to the blood ban in the 1980s, the same cannot be said of feces. There is no pro-poo lobby spending millions of dollars so people can have access to it. In fact, I can tell you most C. diff survivors don't even want to discuss this shit. But we have to, both here in the realm of public policy and more broadly, so that people are aware of C. diff. And to do so, we need FDA to be more forthcoming. Following the FMT safety alert in June on the death of the immune-compromised recipient, lots of folks panicked. We heard people who were set to get an FMT that they were now afraid to. I know of at least 2 doctors who stopped providing FMT because the laboratory testing was cost prohibitive. For 139 days, FDA provided scant details. No information was released on who was being treated, the status of the patients or the facility where the breach happened. Nothing. Then on Wednesday, a thorough but somewhat self-serving article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. I really bristled when I read in the coverage Dr. Elizabeth Homan say that she and her colleagues wanted to set the record straight. With all due respect to Dr. Homan, it is not up to her whether 500,000 people who are struggling with C. diff this year find out the accurate information they need to make an informed decision on whether to take an FMT, to join a clinical trial, or any other treatment. That's the FDA's job, and it's not Mass General's decision to keep this information from the public, and you had no right to sit on it. Since 2013, an estimated 150,000 people have died from C. diff. How many were prevented by an FMT or one of these clinical trials? We don't know for certain, but I would guess it's several thousand or tens of thousands. Whatever regulations you ultimately finalize and enforce must take into account two things: the need to move microbiome therapies beyond fecal transplant as it's currently practiced, and the need to maintain access to FMT patients who need it. So how do we thread this needle? The answer is patience. Patience of doctors, not patients. I'm not sure how many of you were at FDA during the explosion of AIDS activism in the late 80s. Back then, FDA was even less adept at engaging patients. But ACT UP fought to be listened to have a seat at the table, and to be part of developing the policies to guide treatment and permit them access to drugs. When ACT UP was shutting down highways and egging the facade of the FDA's buildings, I know that was very disruptive. But people were fighting for their lives, and it opened the space for so many advances in HIV medicine. A former microbiome executive who worked in AIDS development in the 1980s said that he couldn't believe that ACT UP was targeting the drug developers. Why? Why were they bothering him? Why were they yelling at him and his colleagues? But he told me that in hindsight, those activists were the best allies his company could have had. They made sure that FDA, CDC, and NIH all got more funding. They changed policy so that things could happen more quickly. In fact, many of the policies that we're currently using to speed microbiome therapy development have their roots in AIDS advocacy. I know you all mean well. I know you're overworked and understaffed. That's why PLF advocates every year advocate to secure more funding and resources for FDA, CDC, and NIH. I know that everyone in this room is here because you want to help end this epidemic. But where C. diff and FMT is concerned, you've done a pretty crap job of including patients. This is the third FMT public hearing, but only the first where a C. diff survivor is speaking and an actual patient advocate is speaking. That should not have taken 6 years. In that 6 years, how many times have you had public testimony from C. diff patients? How many times have you solicited input from us? And how many times have you heard from academia, industry, lobbyists, whoever? And I understand that technically this is a public meeting, and I do genuinely appreciate the effort made to invite me and Catherine here. It's a good start, but it's not enough. We need you to do better, not just on FMT, but on all C. diff treatments. As you know, and for good reasons, companies that are in the process of developing treatments cannot engage patients in their clinical trials, but we do. The Peggy Lillis Foundation has more than 40 active and trained advocates and nearly 1,000 families and patients who have survived C. diff in our network. You can engage any of these people to obtain the real-world experiences of C. diff patients, which should guide policy just as much as scientific evidence. By the time I get back to Brooklyn tonight, I will have spent about $600 to be here. And if I wasn't the head of a C. diff-related advocacy group, I would have taken a day off work. 63% of families do not have $500 to cover an unanticipated emergency, let alone come to Silver Spring, Maryland for a public meeting. But you could bring them here. Organizing around infectious diseases is difficult because they tend to be acute. People either recover or they die. Most people do not embrace an identity around them as many do being a cancer survivor. Adding to that difficulty, most people, some 70%, have never heard of C. diff, despite it being the most common healthcare-associated infections. I realize I've been a bit harsh. I hope you take it as the tough love that I intend. The future of FMT development has to include robust engagement with patients and families on the front line of the C. diff epidemic. C. diff must be treated as a national emergency. You can make that happen. So do it for Judy and Joe and Gail and Donald and Betty and Peggy. Thank you.